I'm Chance Dorland, and this is the Spurs Insider, our weekly NBA podcast from ExpressNews.com. And I'm joined now once again by San Antonio Express News sports writer Mike Finger. Great to have you back here on the program, Mike. Let's get right to it. It's been an interesting time with this homestand. They won 5 out of the last 6, some of them big victories, but boy, what a loss to the Bulls. Let's talk about it.
Well, I mean, it just goes to show you that this is not your father's or your grandfather's San Antonio Spurs anymore in terms of being able to take those types of games for granted. And like you mentioned, there was a lot of progress on that homestand. Won some games against some teams that maybe they weren't expected to win. But even when you have a 21-point lead against a team like Chicago, which has been one of the worst teams in the league this season, you just can't let up. There is no longer the Tim Duncan, the Tony Parker, the Manu Ginobili to make sure that things don't get away from you. And it just counts as one loss in the standings, but that's just a reminder that this team might have the capacity to be a playoff team, but it also has kind of the drawbacks and the danger of being much less and to lose to just about anybody.
So the homestand's over. They're actually playing in Orlando as we speak. So we'll have that probably covered in the next podcast episode. But let's talk more about these are some big victories in the homestand, and you think that's the defense finally coming through.
Well, I mean, you look at the defense before the homestand started. I think through the first 26 games, only 5 of them, the Spurs had held their opponent to fewer than 100 points. The last 5 games of the homestand were under 100. So, I mean, that's a pretty remarkable turnaround in terms of just points per game, which doesn't tell you the whole story about defense, but it tells you a lot. And I think the nadir was the Spurs being either the worst, the second worst defensive team in the league. Now they're right back in the middle of the pack just after, a nice stretch of home games. And you knew this was going to happen eventually, that it was going to be kind of, as Manu Ginobili would say, a regression to the mean. A Greg Popovich coach team is not going to be the worst defensive team in the league, even though it looked like it for a while. This doesn't have the defensive aptitude or capability of some of his better teams. But I think where they are right now, middle of the pack, a team that's going to give up a bunch of points some nights, but other nights really put the clamps down. I think that's what we're going to get the rest of the year. It would be helpful if DeJounte Murray was still on this team or was still available. He was supposed to be the head of the beast for this defense heading into this year. He's obviously out for the year with a knee injury. But with what they have, no defensive superstars like they used to have with Kawhi Leonard, no defensive shutdown guys like they have with Danny Green. They're making do, and they're starting to be at least adequate on defense.
So you just mentioned playoffs. This is something on the podcast that a few different times, I think the exact words uttered by people that I've been speaking to, yourself and several other writers for the San Antonio Express News that cover the Spurs. This isn't the team that you're used to. This might not be a team that's going to make it into the playoffs. But right now, the Western Conference playoff race looks a little wide open.
Well, I mean, from 4th place to 14th, I think it's about a 4-game difference. And, it just goes to show that there are no locks beyond the Golden State, beyond probably Denver, beyond maybe Oklahoma City this year. There is the chance that the Spurs get on a hot streak, put things together, guys start playing up to their capabilities. This could be a team that could even get first round home court advantage in the playoffs. But one slip up, one little cold streak, and you're looking at the lottery. And I think there are a lot of teams, maybe a dozen teams in the Western Conference right now, kind of in that same boat. And if you look at the standings on a day-to-day basis, there's a lot of shakeup from one week to the next, from even one day to the next. And I think you're going to have to wait to see maybe January, February to find out who the true contenders are in terms of playoff spots and who might be looking more at the lottery.
Obviously, the victories in this homestand, were pretty impressive, aside from that Bulls game. Is this something that maybe fans, observers can point to and say, this is a change in the team and this means something for what's going to happen down the road? Or fool me once, shame on you, fool me five times, shame on me? Is this something that really we just have to wait and see with this team?
Well, it's just how the real NBA works, and we've made this observation before in the paper and online and on the podcast many times that the Spurs weren't part of the real NBA for the past most of the past 20 years. I mean, they were living kind of in a world that the rest of the NBA wasn't familiar with. Just always knowing that you're going to be in the playoffs, always being able to take for granted that things are going to come together. The ups and downs. This is how the rest of the league deals with all the time. When you're home for 6 games in a row, like the Spurs were, things can look great because NBA teams are better at home than they are on the road, and things looked really good during that homestand. Like you said, beating the Clippers, beating the Sixers, looked really impressive on those nights. And then, the way the league works, you turn around and things aren't going to look as good, and you're going to go through some valleys to go along with your peaks. And I think obviously there's a sense of encouragement that homestand went so well, but I don't think anybody involved, from Greg Popovich to R.C. Buford to anybody in that locker room to even the fans in the stands, nobody thinks that they have this thing figured out and that it's going to be smooth sailing the rest of the way. There's obviously going to be some difficult times ahead. There's going to be some losses that we're going to shake our heads about, but I think just to deal with it on a week-to-week basis, to get through that homestand, winning 5 of 6, and for the defense to turn around like it did, that is something that you take and say, hey, at least the team is improving. It's on the right track, and we'll just see where it goes from here.
So along those same lines, obviously a rebuilding year in a lot of different ways. This is something that has progressed throughout the season so far, just like the defense. What are your thoughts on how the team's coming together? Obviously, you talked about DeJounte Murray. Still some pieces missing, but things coming together.
Yeah, on the rebuilding note, what was interesting with Philadelphia in town earlier this week, it's kind of become a custom, an obligatory thing where anytime the Spurs face the Sixers, Greg Popovich is asked about Brett Brown, his former assistant, who has gone through a really, really difficult few years with Philadelphia and their process, and how many games they lost for 4 years. And Pop used to say year after year when he was asked about Brett Brown, he used to say, "There's no way I could do that. I wouldn't last a month in terms of being able to coach a team that was rebuilding and that wasn't a contender and that had to deal with kind of a ceiling that wasn't as high as Pop was used to." And what's funny now is Brett Brown brings his team into town, and they're the ones that actually have championship aspirations. And Popovich is the one with the team that kind of is rolling the boulder up the hill and having it fall down every day again. And
Yeah, this is like a nice NBA version of the Parent Trap or something.
I mean, it's a complete role reversal. And when Pop said he couldn't do what Brett Brown did, that's probably true because he wouldn't want to lose 60 games every year for 4 years. But he's a lot closer to it than he probably thought he ever would be. This is, for lack of a better term, a rebuilding year for the Spurs. Whether that means they're in the lottery or whether that means they're a playoff team is yet to be decided. But they are definitely rebuilding, and Popovich is dealing with that kind of in his own way. I think he'd prefer to be coaching a team that had championship hopes, but he realized when DeJounte Murray went down, especially, that this was a team that probably was not going to win a title. He'd never say that publicly, but it's a different goal every day than I think this team used to have, and it's been kind of fascinating to watch the way that Pop and R.C. Buford and even the guys in the locker room are kind of dealing with that on a day-to-day basis. It's not that you set your sights lower, but I think you're more realistic about what should be expected of this team and what kind of improvement it can make from day to day. And I think everybody's still kind of getting used to it.
So rolling along here, obviously connected to the team rebuild, the opportunity to do that would be before the trading deadline. What are your thoughts on, the selling, buying? What would you be doing if you were in a position to make some choices?
Well, last week was the time when the players who were just signed this summer were eligible to be traded, and so you saw Trevor Ariza getting traded from the Suns to the Wizards, and that's the type of guy that obviously could help this first team. They need a guy who can defend and hit 3-pointers, and that would kind of shore up two areas of need with one trade, but there are two problems with that. First of all, the Spurs don't necessarily have the players and picks and packages to offer a team like Phoenix that other teams can. And the other thing is, which is getting at your question, is this team doesn't know if it's a buyer or seller yet. And one of the most common questions that we get from fans, from readers, from people on Twitter, people online is why doesn't this team tank and lose on purpose and collect draft picks and sell off all their veterans and start over again?
The most common request or the most common message that you're getting is why don't they just ruin the season? Wow.
Of course, of course. Yeah. I mean that's the popular thing because the way Spurs fans have been kind of built to think over the years is if you tank 1 year, you get David Robinson. If you tank a second year, you get Tim Duncan. Those are the only two losing seasons this team has had in the last 30. And they think, oh, if you're not going to win a championship, well, then just go to the lottery and get you another Tim Duncan or David Robinson.
Yeah, if you're not first, you're last. But if you're last, you got to pick.
Yeah, but it doesn't. There hasn't been too many Tim Duncans, and there hasn't been too many David Robinsons, and so I mean, you ask Sacramento, who has had 12 lottery picks over the past decade, and they're still not good. Usually, tanking sounds great in theory. It just doesn't always work out that way. There's no guarantee that if you tank 1 year, you're going to be better. Sometimes you end up worse, and so kind of the point of the trade deadline that we're talking about here is. There's going to be a time in January up to the trade deadline where teams have to decide: are we buyers or are we sellers? A lot of teams in the Western Conference are going to be asking that question of themselves over the next month or two, and I think the Spurs are going to learn a lot about themselves during that same time. And if they keep winning like they did on this homestand, and they're up in fifth, sixth, even fourth place in the West, well, then obviously it would be stupid to sell off veterans. And maybe you think about adding a piece to help you be more competitive in the playoffs this year. But if you're mired in that situation where they were early in the season and they're still stuck in 10th or 11th and it just doesn't look like it's going to come together, well, then you think about, well, maybe it is time to sell off a couple of pieces and see if you can get value for veteran players. Where teams might be willing to give up draft picks. I'm not sure they have any guys that would fetch those type of elite picks that they'd be looking for, elite young talents. But I guess the overall point here is there's no need to rush into that decision here in mid-December when you have 6 weeks or so to figure out what exactly you're going to be as a team and whether it's worth it to kind of make a leap or take a step back. I think that's a decision for another day, and everybody can just chill till then.
You just mentioned a trade that already took place that might have worked for the Spurs. Obviously, that ship has set sail. But anything that is out on your radar that might be a good pickup for San Antonio?
I think it's still far too early. Again, there are other teams. The team that did the buying in that situation was Washington. It decided to pick up a veteran in Trevor Ariza, and a few weeks before that, Washington was reported as a team that was looking to sell everybody off. So I think there's going to be too much fluctuation between now and then to know exactly A, who's available, and B, what it would take to get those type of players. So I'm not going to. As good as it would be for the hit count on this podcast, I'm not going to start any rumors about
Mike Finger says hold. Yeah, that'll be a popular episode.
Yeah, and so I think all that becomes clearer as we get into the next calendar year, into January. You're going to hear a lot of reports about who teams are going to be trying to move, maybe even who teams might want from the Spurs. And again, we will have to wait and see where the Spurs are in the standings and where everybody else is in the standings before we have any more clarity on that.
Fair enough, man. I assume your bank account's doing well without frivolous purchases with that type of talk. We got some time left to definitely give you any more time that you need for some final thoughts, anything we haven't come up with yet. But I do want to talk about this upcoming schedule. So they're playing Orlando right now. We'll talk about that on the next episode, but obviously several more games before the end of the year.
Yeah, I mean, and it's more of the feeling out process in terms of uh, what kind of team this is going to be. I know I've repeated that over and over again, but the NBA season is so long, and this team, especially the one that the Spurs just put together this offseason, is so new, where you have a DeMar DeRozan trying to figure out where he fits into this system. And Jakob Poeltl, who I think has really come on as a role player, is he going to take a bigger role? Are we ever going to see Lonnie Walker start to get some reps? Who's after his stint in the G League? I think there's a lot to be determined. But if you talk about upcoming games, I mean, it appears at first glance to be a pretty stout test in terms of I think there's Rockets, there's a couple of Nuggets games, there's the Clippers before the end of the year, there's the Celtics. All those teams you figure to be playoff teams, but the Spurs so far this season have actually played better against those types of teams than they have against some of the not so great teams. I mean, two of the worst.
The Bulls, the Suns, at least some of the time against the Suns.
Yeah, and I mean the Spurs played really well against the Lakers. They've beaten the Warriors. They've done well against the Rockets. They just knocked off the Sixers, so they've kind of been playing up and down to the level of competition, and we'll have to see if that continues.
And thank you to San Antonio Express News sports writer Mike Finger for joining me for today's episode of the Spurs Insider, our weekly NBA podcast from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.